The restaurant fell silent as 8-year-old Jacob Mercer's sobs echoed through the elegant dining room. His father, tech mogul Richard Mercer, looked on helplessly, his usual commanding presence diminished by his son's pain. What happened next would change their lives forever, and it all began with 7 simple words from an unexpected source. Jacob hadn't always been this way. Once a bright, cheerful child who charmed everyone he met, something had shifted in him 6 months ago. The change was as sudden as it was heartbreaking. Richard had tried everything: expensive therapists, exotic vacations, the latest gaming systems, but nothing seemed to reach the boy who was slipping further away each day. Tonight's meltdown was just the latest in a series of increasingly concerning episodes, but no one could have predicted how this particular evening would unfold. Richard Mercer had built Mercer Tech from nothing into a billion-dollar empire, solving complex problems that baffled others in his industry. Yet his son's unhappiness remained the one puzzle he couldn't solve. As Jacob's tears continued to fall, Richard wondered if he had failed at the one job that truly mattered. Across the restaurant, 7-year-old Lily Chen watched the scene unfold with curious eyes. Despite her mother's gentle attempts to redirect her attention, Lily couldn't look away from the boy whose pain seemed to fill the entire room. Without warning, she slipped from her chair and approached the Mercer's table, ignoring her mother's whispered protests. What happened in the next few moments would set in motion a chain of events that would heal wounds deeper than anyone realized existed. "He only needs a sister," Lily whispered, standing on tiptoes to reach Jacob's ear. The sobbing stopped instantly. Jacob looked at the little girl with red-rimmed eyes, then at his father with an expression Richard hadn't seen in months: hope. Richard Mercer had faced hostile takeovers and market crashes without flinching, but this simple statement from a child he'd never met before knocked the wind from his lungs. Could it really be that simple? And if it was, how had he missed it? The truth was far more complicated than anyone in that restaurant could have imagined. 6 months earlier, Richard's life had been perfect, at least on paper. Mercer Tech's stock was soaring, his marriage to Elizabeth seemed solid after 12 years, and Jacob was thriving. Then came the night that shattered everything. The argument that began over something trivial, Elizabeth's desire to adopt a child to give Jacob a sibling, escalated into revelations about their marriage that couldn't be unheard. "You've never wanted what I want," Elizabeth had said, her voice quiet but firm. "A real family. A home that's more than a showcase. Children who know their father beyond his public image." Richard had dismissed her concerns, pointing to their sprawling mansion, Jacob's private school education, the vacations, the privileges. "He has everything a child could want," he'd insisted. Elizabeth's response still haunted him, "except what he needs most." The next morning, she was gone. The divorce papers arrived 3 days later, citing irreconcilable differences. Richard had been blindsided, but he'd handled it like every other challenge in his life, efficiently, discreetly, and with minimal disruption to his business. He'd assumed Jacob would adjust. Children were resilient, weren't they? But Jacob hadn't adjusted. He'd withdrawn, his grades had slipped, and the light in his eyes had dimmed. Richard had thrown money at the problem, hiring the best child psychologist in the city, but Jacob refused to open up. The psychologist suggested that Jacob was grieving not just his mother's absence but also the loss of the future he'd imagined, including the sibling his parents had been discussing. Richard had dismissed this theory. Until now. As Lily stood beside their table, her mother hurried over with embarrassment written across her face. "I'm so sorry," she began, reaching for her daughter's hand. "Lily, you shouldn't interrupt people's dinners." "It's quite all right," Richard said, studying the little girl with newfound interest. "What's your name?" "Lily Chen," she answered confidently. "I'm 7 3/4. "And what makes you think Jacob needs a sister, Lily?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. Lily shrugged as if the answer was obvious. "Because he looks lonely. I was lonely too, before my baby brother came. Even though he's annoying sometimes, it's better than being alone. Jacob, who had barely spoken to anyone in weeks, suddenly found his voice. Dad, remember when Mom wanted to adopt? She showed me pictures of kids who needed families. Richard felt his chest tighten. Elizabeth had been researching adoption agencies for months before their separation. She'd been particularly drawn to international adoption, showing Jacob photos of children from around the world who needed homes. Richard had shut down the conversation every time, citing their busy lives and the complications of bringing another child into their family. I remember, Richard said softly, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. Mrs. Chen apologized again and guided Lily back to their table, but the damage, or perhaps the healing, had already begun. Jacob wiped his tears and, for the first time in months, finished his dinner. On the drive home, he asked the question Richard had been dreading, can we still adopt a sister even though Mom's gone? Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter. It's not that simple, buddy. Why not? Jacob persisted. You can do anything. That's what you always say. Richard had built his reputation on solving impossible problems, on seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. Could he approach this challenge with the same determination? The thought terrified him. He wasn't equipped to raise 2 children on his own. His schedule was punishing, his parenting skills questionable at best. And yet, looking at Jacob's hopeful expression in the rearview mirror, he couldn't bring himself to extinguish that spark. Let me think about it, he said finally. That night, after tucking Jacob in, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, calling his ex-wife. Elizabeth answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious. Richard? Is everything okay? Is Jacob all right? He's fine, Richard assured her. But I need your advice. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. In 12 years of marriage and 6 months of divorce, Richard Mercer had never asked for Elizabeth's advice on anything. I'm listening, she said finally. Richard recounted the evening's events, from Jacob's tears to Lily's unexpected intervention. He wants a sister, he concluded. And I think you were right all along. Another long pause. Richard, adoption isn't something you do on a whim because a stranger's child made a suggestion. It's a lifetime commitment. I know that, Richard said, surprising himself with his certainty. But Jacob needs this. Maybe I do too. What exactly are you asking me? Richard took a deep breath. Help me. Guide me through this process. You did all the research before. You know what's involved. And you shut me down at every turn, Elizabeth reminded him, though her tone held more sadness than bitterness. I was wrong, Richard admitted. I was focused on building an empire instead of a family. I thought giving Jacob things was the same as giving him what he needed. The conversation lasted well into the night. By morning, Richard had a plan, or at least the beginning of one. Elizabeth agreed to share her research and even offered to attend preliminary meetings with adoption agencies. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a truce for Jacob's sake. The next few months were a crash course in humility for Richard Mercer. The adoption process stripped away his privileged status, subjecting him to the same scrutiny as any other prospective parent. Home studies, background checks, parenting classes, none of his wealth or influence could expedite these requirements. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Richard couldn't simply write a check to get what he wanted. Jacob, meanwhile, had transformed. The possibility of a sister had given him purpose. He helped prepare the spare bedroom, choosing colors and furniture with enthusiasm Richard hadn't seen since before Elizabeth left. He talked about it constantly, speculating about what his future sister might like, what games they would play, what he would teach her. 4 months into the process, their social worker, Diane, called with news. There's a child I'd like you to consider, she said. Her situation is complicated. The girl's name was Mai, a 5-year-old from Vietnam. Both her parents had died in an accident, leaving her in the care of an elderly grandmother who could no longer manage. Mai had been in an orphanage for 8 months. She was bright but withdrawn, struggling to connect with potential adoptive families. She's been matched twice before, Diane explained, but both families ultimately chose other children. She's starting to believe no one wants her. Richard felt an unexpected kinship with this child he'd never met. He knew what it was like to be unwanted. His own childhood had been marked by his father's indifference and his mother's absence. It was a wound he'd covered with achievement and wealth, but had never truly healed. "Can we meet her?" Richard asked, surprising himself with his eagerness. 2 weeks later, Richard and Jacob were on a plane to Vietnam. Elizabeth had helped prepare them, teaching Jacob a few Vietnamese phrases and advising Richard on cultural sensitivities. The journey was long, the bureaucracy frustrating, but finally, they stood outside a modest building in Hanoi, about to meet the child who might become part of their family. Mai was smaller than her age would suggest, with solemn eyes that seemed to evaluate everything. She didn't smile when they were introduced, but she didn't hide either. She answered their questions politely through a translator, watching Jacob with particular interest when he showed her pictures of their home. "Would you like to come live with us?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling slightly with nervousness. Mai considered the question carefully before responding. "Will I be your sister forever, or will you send me back?" The translator hesitated before relaying this, but Richard nodded for her to continue. The question broke his heart, but he understood it. Mai needed honesty, not platitudes. "Forever," Richard promised, looking directly into her eyes. "Family is forever." Mai didn't smile, but something in her posture relaxed slightly. "I will think about it," she said with dignity beyond her years. They visited every day for a week. Jacob brought small gifts, a drawing he'd made, a bracelet he'd chosen. Richard simply showed up, consistent and patient in a way he'd never been in business negotiations. By the 5th day, Mai was showing Jacob how to fold origami animals. By the 7th, she asked when they would go home, together. The adoption process took another 3 months to finalize. Richard restructured his entire company during this time, delegating responsibilities he'd previously insisted on handling personally. He installed a home office, reduced his travel schedule by 70%, and hired a Vietnamese tutor for both himself and Jacob. Elizabeth visited regularly, forming her own bond with Mai and helping ease her transition. Mai's arrival in America was both joyful and challenging. She experienced nightmares, language frustrations, and moments of overwhelming grief for her first family. Richard discovered reserves of patience he hadn't known he possessed. Jacob proved to be an exceptional brother, intuitive about when to engage Mai and when to give her space. 6 months after that fateful dinner, the Mercers returned to the same restaurant. This time, they were 4 instead of 2, Richard, Jacob, Mai, and Elizabeth, who had become a regular presence in their lives again. As they settled at their table, Richard noticed a familiar face across the room. Lily Chen was celebrating her 8th birthday with her family. Her eyes widened when she spotted Jacob, who was laughing at something Mai had said. With her parents' permission, Richard approached their table. "Lily, I don't know if you remember us, but we met here several months ago. I wanted to thank you." Lily looked confused. "For what?" "For seeing what we couldn't see ourselves," Richard explained. "You were right about Jacob needing a sister." He introduced her to Mai, who shyly offered the origami crane she'd been folding at their table. Lily accepted it with delight, and soon the 2 girls were chatting as if they'd known each other forever. Later that evening, as Richard watched Jacob and Mai playing a board game while Elizabeth looked on with a smile, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. His company was still successful, but it no longer defined him. His relationship with Elizabeth had evolved into something he hadn't anticipated, a friendship based on mutual respect and their shared love for their children. Most importantly, his son was happy again. And Richard himself had discovered that the most valuable acquisition of his life hadn't been a company or a property, but a small girl with solemn eyes who had taught him the true meaning of family. Sometimes the wisest words come from the most unexpected sources. For the Mercers, healing began with 7 simple words from a child: "He only needs a sister." And in finding Mai, they had all found pieces of themselves they didn't know were missing. If this story touched your heart, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to our channel for more stories that celebrate the unexpected ways families come together. Remember, sometimes the family we need isn't always the one we're born into, sometimes it's the one we build together, one brave decision at a time.